The metal cylinder was the size of a coffee can and covered in decades of grime, but when Dorothy wiped away the dust with her cardigan sleeve, she saw the words etched into the brass plate. Patent pending, property of R. Castellano, 1957, do not open. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this mystery has already captivated you, tell us where you're watching from. And to make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or life-changing discoveries, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. Frank's knees cracked as he crouched beside her in the half-light of Unit 42, the smallest storage space at Meadowbrook Self-Storage. They'd won it for $2 at auction, literally $2, because no one else had even bothered to bid. The unit was barely 6 by 6 feet, and from the doorway it looked empty, except for a few collapsed cardboard boxes and what appeared to be decades of accumulated dust and spiderwebs. But Dorothy had insisted they check the corners, the way she always did. 49 years of marriage had taught Frank that when Dorothy got that feeling, the one she called her grandmother's intuition, it was worth paying attention. So they'd driven their 2003 Buick LeSabre to the storage facility on this gray Tuesday morning in October, bringing bolt cutters they'd borrowed from their neighbor Ed, who'd asked no questions but raised his eyebrows significantly. The cylinder had been wedged in the back corner, hidden behind the boxes, almost invisible against the concrete wall. If Dorothy hadn't brought Frank's old camping flashlight, they'd have missed it entirely. "Don't open it?" Frank read aloud, his voice gravelly from 50 years of cigarettes he'd quit a decade ago. Well, that's not ominous at all. "R. Castellano," Dorothy murmured, turning the cylinder over in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, and something shifted inside. Not liquid, but something solid that moved with a mechanical precision. "Frank, do you remember?" "Roberto Castellano!" Frank interrupted, his eyes widening. "Jesus, Dorothy, Roberto Castellano!" Dorothy felt her heart quicken. She was 76 years old, and her doctor had told her to avoid excitement, but this was impossible to ignore. Roberto Castellano had been something of a local legend in their small New Jersey town, a brilliant inventor who'd worked for Bell Labs in the 1950s, the kind of genius who could fix anything, build anything, imagine things that wouldn't exist for decades. He'd also died in 1958 in a house fire that had consumed his workshop and supposedly all his inventions and research. Dorothy had been 9 years old when it happened, but she still remembered the whispers, that the fire hadn't been an accident, that Castellano had been working on something big, something that threatened powerful interests. "That's just a story," Frank said, reading her expression. "Small-town nonsense. People love a conspiracy." "Then why is his invention in an abandoned storage unit?" Dorothy countered. "And why does it say, 'Do not open'?" Frank reached for the cylinder, but Dorothy pulled it back. "The note says—" "The note is 70 years old, Dot, and Roberto Castellano is dead. Whatever he was protecting, it doesn't matter anymore." But Dorothy's hands trembled as she held the cylinder. Something about this felt important, felt dangerous. The storage unit suddenly seemed smaller, the air thicker. Through the open door, she could see the facility manager's office, a teenager with headphones and a magazine, completely uninterested in the elderly couple poking through a $2 unit. "We should take it home," she said finally. "Research it, find out what it is before we open it." Frank sighed, but nodded. They'd been married long enough that he knew when to argue and when to surrender. Besides, Dorothy was usually right about these things. That intuition of hers had saved them more than once, like when she'd insisted they skip a vacation to Florida the week Hurricane Andrew hit, or when she'd told Frank to get his strange headache checked out, which turned out to be a minor stroke they'd caught just in time. They wrapped the cylinder in an old beach towel Dorothy kept in the car and drove home in silence, both of them acutely aware of the mysterious object resting between them on the bench seat. Their house was a small Cape Cod on Elm Street, the same house where they'd raised their 2 children, both of whom now lived on the opposite coast with families of their own. Inside, Dorothy cleared the dining room table while Frank made coffee. They hadn't used this room for actual dining in years. It had become a repository for jigsaw puzzles, library books, and Frank's model trains. But today, they needed space, needed to approach this systematically. Dorothy retrieved her laptop, a gift from their daughter 3 Christmases ago that she'd slowly, reluctantly learned to use. While Frank examined the cylinder with a magnifying glass, muttering about the craftsmanship, Dorothy typed Roberto Castellano, inventor, New Jersey, into Google. The results were sparse. A few mentions in local historical archives, an obituary from 1958, a single photograph from a Bell Labs newsletter showing a serious-looking man in his 40s standing beside what appeared to be an early computer system. But then she found it, a blog post from 2012, written by someone named Marcus Yates, who claimed to be researching lost inventions of the Cold War era. Roberto Castellano was working on something revolutionary in 1957. According to his surviving correspondence with a colleague at MIT, he'd developed a prototype for what he called a temporal storage device, not time travel, but a way to preserve information in a format that would remain stable for centuries, possibly millennia. The technology was apparently far ahead of its time, involving principles that wouldn't be fully understood until the development of quantum computing in the 21st century. Costello died in a suspicious fire in March 1958, just weeks before he was scheduled to present his findings to a government committee. All his research was believed destroyed, but rumors persisted that he'd hidden a prototype, that somewhere his invention survived. Dorothy felt cold despite the October heat that lingered in their unair-conditioned house. "Frank," she said quietly, "you should read this." He did, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. When he finished, he set down the magnifying glass and looked at the cylinder with new respect and new wariness. "This could be worth," he started. "Millions," Dorothy finished, "if it's real, if it works, if it's actually what that blogger thinks it is." "We should call someone," Frank said, "an expert, a museum. Hell, maybe even the FBI if this is Cold War stuff." But before Dorothy could respond, there was a knock at the door. They both froze. They weren't expecting anyone. Their daughter called on Wednesdays, their son on weekends. Ed next door just walked in if he needed something. Mail didn't come until afternoon. Frank moved to answer it, but Dorothy grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "What if?" "What if what? Someone tracked us from the storage unit? Dot, that's..." Another knock, more insistent this time. Frank gently extracted himself from Dorothy's grip and walked to the front door. Through the window beside it, Dorothy could see a man in his 30s, wearing an expensive-looking suit and holding a briefcase. He didn't look threatening, but he also didn't look like he belonged in their working-class neighborhood. Frank opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "Yes?" "Mr. Keating? Frank Keating?" The man's smile was professional, practiced. "My name is David Chen. I represent a private collector who's very interested in items related to Roberto Castellano. I understand you may have recently acquired something from a storage unit." Dorothy's blood ran cold. How could he possibly know? They'd left the facility less than an hour ago. The teenager in the office had barely looked up from his magazine. Frank's jaw tightened. "I think you have the wrong house." "I don't think I do, Mr. Keating. And I want to assure you, my client is prepared to be very generous. If you found something that belonged to Mr. Castellano, we're authorized to offer $50,000, no questions asked." $50,000? For a $2 storage unit? Dorothy felt dizzy. Frank, however, had spent 30 years as a union steward at the local manufacturing plant. He knew when someone was trying to pull something. "If it's worth $50,000 to your client, it's worth more to us. Thanks for stopping by." He started to close the door, but Chen's hand shot out, stopping it. "Mr. Keating, please, you don't understand what you found. That device, it's not just valuable, it's dangerous. There are people who've been looking for it for decades. Not all of them have good intentions." "And you do?" Frank shot back. Chen's professional smile faltered. "I represent someone who wants to preserve Castellano's legacy, to make sure his invention is understood and protected. But there are others, corporations, foreign governments, individuals with resources you can't imagine, who want it for other reasons." "Why should we believe you?" Dorothy asked, appearing behind Frank's shoulder. "You show up an hour after we find this thing. How did you even know?" Chen hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The storage facility has been monitored for years. Unit 42 was never actually abandoned. Payments were made through an anonymous trust. But the trust expired last month, and the unit went to auction. We knew someone would eventually buy it. We just didn't know who or when." "So you've been watching us?" Frank said, his voice hard. "To protect you," Chen insisted. "Mr. and Mrs. Keating, please, let me come inside. 5 minutes. I'll explain everything, and then you can decide what to do." Dorothy and Frank looked at each other. 49 years of marriage meant they could have entire conversations without words. Frank's eyes asked, "What do you think?" Dorothy's answered, "I don't trust him, but I want to know more." Frank unlatched the chain. Chen stepped inside, and Dorothy was struck by how out of place he looked in their modest home, with its worn carpet and furniture they'd bought in the 1980s. He glanced at the dining room, at the cylinder on the table, and something flickered across his face. Relief? Or maybe hunger? "Please don't touch it," Dorothy said sharply. Chen raised his hands. "I wouldn't dream of it. May I sit?" They settled in the living room, Chen on the floral couch, Frank and Dorothy in their matching recliners. The cylinder remained on the dining room table, visible through the archway, like a fourth presence in the conversation. "Roberto Castellano," Chen began, "was working on information storage in 1957, but not the way we think of it now, not computer hard drives or magnetic tape. He was working with quantum states, with ways to encode information at the atomic level. The device you found is a prototype of what he called a quantum time capsule." "The blog said temporal storage," Dorothy interjected. Chen looked surprised. "You've done research already. Good. Yes, temporal storage. Not time travel, but a way to store information that would remain perfectly stable regardless of how much time passed. No degradation, no decay. Castellano believed you could store the entire contents of a library in a device the size of that cylinder, and it would be readable 1,000 years from now." "In 1957, Frank said skeptically, "we didn't even have transistors widely available yet." "Exactly." Which is why Bell Labs and certain government agencies were so interested, and so threatened. Castellano's work was decades ahead of his time, possibly centuries. He'd intuited principles that quantum physicists wouldn't formally describe until the 1990s. "So what happened to him?" Dorothy asked. Chen's expression darkened. "The official story is an accidental fire. The unofficial story? There were multiple parties interested in Castellano's work. The US government wanted it for military applications. The Soviets wanted it for the same reason. And certain corporations realized that if information storage could be perfected that thoroughly, it would disrupt multiple industries, from libraries to computers to film and music. Someone killed him," Dorothy said flatly. "That's the theory, but it was never proven. What we do know is that his workshop burned, his research was destroyed, and his family, a wife and young son, moved to California within a month and changed their name." Frank leaned forward. "If his research was destroyed, what's in that cylinder? We don't know. It could be the only working prototype. It could be the complete plans for how to build more. It could be something else entirely. Castellano was working on multiple projects simultaneously. But whatever it is, it's been hidden for 67 years. And now it's on your dining room table. The three of them sat in silence, the weight of history pressing down. Finally, Dorothy asked the question that had been gnawing at her. Why should we trust you? What makes your client better than the others who want this? Chen reached into his briefcase and pulled out a photograph. It showed an elderly man in a wheelchair, gaunt and frail, but with sharp, intelligent eyes. This is Robert Castellano Jr., Robert's son. He's 83 now, dying of emphysema. He spent his entire life trying to understand what his father created. My client wants to buy the device and give it to him to let him finally see his father's legacy before he dies. Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. A son searching for his father, an old man dying with questions unanswered. It touched something deep in her. She'd lost her own father young, had spent years wishing she could ask him questions, hear his voice one more time. But Frank was more practical. If your client is so noble, why the secrecy? Why not just tell us this from the start? Because the moment you open that cylinder, if you can open it, the information becomes vulnerable. There are people with sophisticated monitoring equipment who could detect any kind of quantum signature. We have to move carefully. How do we know that picture is really Castellano's son? Frank pressed. How do we know any of this is true? Chen smiled thinly. You don't, which is why I'm offering you something better than trust. I'm offering you verification. Take the cylinder to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison at Princeton. She's a quantum physicist who's written extensively on early quantum theory. She'll be able to tell you if the device is genuine. Then you can decide what to do with it. He stood, leaving a business card on the coffee table. The offer of $50,000 stands for the next 48 hours. After that, I can't guarantee my client will be the only one making offers, or that all offers will be made politely. The implied threat hung in the air as Frank showed Chen to the door. When he was gone, Frank locked the door, the deadbolt, and the chain, something he never bothered with during the day. Well, he said, returning to the living room, that was ominous as hell. Dorothy was staring at the business card. Frank, what if he's right? What if this thing really is dangerous? Then we should probably stop keeping it on the dining room table like a centerpiece. They moved the cylinder to the basement, which felt marginally safer, though Dorothy wasn't sure why. Out of sight wasn't really out of mind, and it certainly wouldn't stop anyone determined to take it. That night, neither of them slept well. Dorothy kept hearing noises, cars passing that slowed down near their house, footsteps on the sidewalk that might or might not have been real, the creak of floorboards that could have been just the old house settling, but felt more sinister. At 3 a.m., Frank found her in the kitchen, making tea and staring out the window at their quiet street. "We could just give it back," he said softly. "Tell the storage facility we found something valuable, let them deal with it." "And spend the rest of our lives wondering?" Dorothy shook her head. "Besides, Chen said the trust expired. Legally, it's ours." "Legally?" Frank laughed without humor. "If people really killed Castellano for this, I don't think they care much about legality." Dorothy turned to face him. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, he looked every one of his 79 years, the weight of age and worry etched into his face. They'd lived a quiet life, a good life. They didn't need excitement. They certainly didn't need danger. But they also didn't need to live the rest of their years wondering what if. "Tomorrow," she said, "we go to Princeton. We find this Dr. Morrison. We get answers." Frank nodded slowly. "And if Chen was telling the truth, if there really are dangerous people looking for this, then we'll deal with that too, together, like we always have." He crossed the kitchen and pulled her into a hug. She fit against him the way she had for 49 years, familiar and comforting. Whatever they'd stumbled into, they'd face it the way they'd faced everything, together. The next morning, they drove to Princeton. Dorothy had called ahead, claiming to be a journalist researching early quantum theory, and Dr. Morrison's assistant had fit them in for a 2 p.m. appointment. They left early, partly to avoid traffic, and partly because neither wanted to be in the house any longer than necessary. The cylinder rode in a locked toolbox in the trunk, which seemed absurd but also prudent. Princeton's campus was beautiful in October, the trees ablaze with autumn colors. Dr. Morrison's office was in the physics building, 3rd floor, a cramped space overflowing with papers, books, and what appeared to be parts of various experimental apparatus. Dr. Morrison herself was younger than Dorothy expected, maybe 50, with wild gray-streaked hair and glasses perched on top of her head. She looked up from her desk as they entered, blinking as if surfacing from deep water. "The journalists about early quantum theory?" she asked. "Not exactly," Frank said. "We lied about that. Sorry." Dorothy shot him a look, but Morrison just laughed. "I appreciate the honesty. So, what do you really want?" Dorothy set the toolbox on the desk. "We want you to tell us if this is real." She opened it, revealing the cylinder. Morrison's expression transformed instantly, the vague, distracted look replaced by intense focus. She reached for the cylinder, then stopped. "May I?" "Please." Morrison lifted it carefully, turning it in the light, examining the brass plate and the seams where the cylinder was sealed. Her fingers traced the edges with the delicate precision of someone who understood that some objects required reverence. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. "A storage unit," Frank said. "It's a long story." "And you think it's related to Roberto Castellano?" It wasn't a question. Dorothy felt a chill. "You know about him?" "Every quantum physicist knows about him. He's like our version of a ghost story. The brilliant mind who saw too far ahead, who understood principles that wouldn't be formalized for decades. Most of us assume his work was exaggerated, that the stories grew in the telling." She set the cylinder down gently. "But this—" "If this is what I think it is?" Dorothy asked. Morrison moved to her computer, pulling up files and images. In 1957, Castellano wrote a letter to a colleague at MIT. The letter survived. It's in the MIT archives. In it, he described what he called a quantum time capsule, a device that could store information in quantum states that would remain stable indefinitely. The mathematics he included in that letter were— She paused, searching for words. They were insane, beautiful and insane. They described quantum coherence in a way that shouldn't have been possible with 1950s understanding. She pulled up an image, a page from what appeared to be an old letter covered in handwritten equations. "Look at this." He's describing quantum error correction codes that weren't formally invented until the 1990s. He's intuiting principles about topological quantum computing that we're still struggling to implement today. "So, it's real," Frank said. "The cylinder is real." "I'd need to examine it more thoroughly, but yes, I believe so. The construction is consistent with his descriptions. The weight suggests dense materials, possibly rare earth elements that would have been incredibly expensive in the 1950s. And the sealing mechanism." She peered at where the cylinder's top and bottom met. "This isn't a simple screw top. There's some kind of locking mechanism, possibly one that requires specific conditions to open. Temperature, pressure, maybe even a quantum key." "Can you open it?" Dorothy asked. "Me? No. I wouldn't even try without specialized equipment and a clean room environment. If there really is quantum information storage inside, exposing it to the wrong conditions could destroy it instantly." "But someone could open it," Frank pressed. "With the right resources, yes. A major research university, a government lab, possibly some well-funded private research groups." Morrison looked at them seriously. "Why are you asking? What are you planning to do with this?" Dorothy and Frank exchanged glances. Morrison caught it. "You're not the only ones looking for this," she said. It wasn't a question. Someone else knows you have it. A man came to our house yesterday, Dorothy admitted. Said he represented a collector, offered $50,000. Morrison's expression darkened. And you didn't take it? Should we have? I don't know, but I can tell you this. If word gets out that Castellano's prototype has been found, you're going to have more than collectors knocking on your door. This device could revolutionize information storage. It could make current quantum computing look primitive. The commercial applications alone would be worth billions. Billions, Frank repeated numbly. At least. And that's assuming it only does what Castellanos claimed. If it does more, if he figured out other applications of quantum coherence, the value could be incalculable. Morrison carefully placed the cylinder back in the toolbox. My honest advice? Take it to the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress. Donate it. Get a tax write-off. Let someone else deal with the consequences. But it's ours, Dorothy said, legally. Legal isn't the same as safe. If this is what I think it is, you're holding something that powerful people have wanted for 70 years. People who've possibly already killed for it. The drive home was tense and silent. The cylinder was back in the trunk, but it might as well have been sitting between them on the seat, pulsing with significance. By the time they pulled into their driveway, Dorothy had a headache building behind her eyes, and Frank's jaw was clenched so tight she worried about his teeth. Inside, there was another visitor waiting. Not David Chen this time, but a woman in her 60s, wearing a tailored pantsuit and carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. She was sitting on their front porch like she had every right to be there. Miss and Mrs. Keating, she said, standing as they approached. My name is Patricia Vance. I work for the Department of Defense. I'd like to talk to you about an item of national security interest that's recently come into your possession. Frank's hand tightened on the toolbox. We don't know what you're talking about. Vance smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Please, we both know that's not true. Roberto Castellano's prototype has been on a government watch list since 1958. The moment it was removed from that storage unit, we were notified. Now, you can cooperate and be compensated fairly, or we can invoke eminent domain and take it. Your choice. Dorothy felt anger cut through her fear. You've known where it was for 67 years and did nothing? We knew the general location, not the specific unit. The trust was set up in such a way that breaking it early would have triggered complications. But now that it's expired and the device is in private hands, the situation has changed. Changed how? Frank demanded. It's no longer legally protected, which means we're not the only ones who can take it, which means you're in danger as long as you have it. Vance's expression softened slightly. I'm actually trying to help you. Turn it over, accept reasonable compensation, and this ends quietly. Keep it, and by tomorrow morning, you'll have foreign intelligence services, corporate espionage teams, and private collectors all descending on your quiet little life. How much is reasonable compensation? Frank asked. $100,000. Double what Chen had offered. Dorothy felt the temptation. $100,000 would set them up comfortably for the rest of their years, pay for the assisted living facility they might eventually need, leave something for their kids. But something about Vance's smile bothered her. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. We need time to think about it, Dorothy said. Vance's smile tightened. I can give you until tomorrow morning. After that, I invoke eminent domain and you get nothing. Fair warning, once the paperwork is filed, other interested parties will see it. Your window of safety closes fast. She left a card, government issue, official looking, and walked to a black SUV parked down the street. Dorothy and Frank watched her drive away, then hurried inside, locking the door behind them. We're in over our heads, Frank said, setting the toolbox on the kitchen counter. Way over our heads. Dorothy nodded, her mind racing. 2 offers now, both accompanied by threats. And if Morrison was right, there would be more. They needed help, needed someone they could trust. She pulled out her phone and called their son, Michael, in California. He was a patent lawyer, dealt with intellectual property disputes. If anyone would know how to navigate this, it would be him. He answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" "Michael, we need your help, legal help. And we need you not to tell anyone, not your sister, not your wife, not anyone." The distraction left his voice immediately. "What's wrong?" Dorothy told him everything, the storage unit, the cylinder, the offers, the threats. As she talked, she could hear Michael typing, presumably researching as she spoke. "Mom," he said when she finished, "I need you to listen very carefully. Do not sell that device to anyone. Do not let anyone take it. And especially do not let the government claim eminent domain." Why not? Because eminent domain requires due process and fair compensation. If they're offering to do it that quickly, they're bluffing. They don't have the legal standing, which means they're desperate. And if they're desperate, the device is worth more than anyone's admitting. But we're not equipped to... I know, which is why I'm flying out tonight. Don't open the device, don't let anyone in the house, and don't answer the door unless it's me. I'm calling a colleague who specializes in Cold War intellectual property. Yes, that's a real specialty, and we're going to figure this out together. Mom, listen, you and Dad stumbled onto something significant, maybe the most significant discovery of Castellano's life, but that means you're sitting on a fortune, and everyone knows it. The next 24 hours are going to be critical. Just hold on until I get there. He hung up, leaving Dorothy and Frank staring at each other in the sudden silence of their kitchen. "Our son is flying cross-country because of a $2 storage unit," Frank said finally. "This is insane." "It's been insane since we found that photograph." Dorothy stopped. "Frank, the photograph." "What photograph?" "On the cylinder, there was a photograph. Old, faded, tucked into the seam where the brass plate meets the body. I saw it when Morrison was examining the cylinder. I thought it was just dirt, but..." They opened the toolbox. Sure enough, wedged so tightly they'd missed it, was a tiny photograph, no bigger than a postage stamp. Frank's reading glasses came out, and they peered at the image together. It showed a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, holding hands with a man in a laboratory coat. Behind them, visible through a window, was what appeared to be Bell Labs. The man was Roberto Castellano. Dorothy recognized him from the archival photo she'd found online. The boy must be his son. On the back, written in faded pencil, "For Bobby, may you find this when you're ready to understand. Love, Dad." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. He left it for his son. The whole thing. It was meant for his son to find. "But his son never found it," Frank said quietly, "because someone hid it in a storage unit and set up a trust that wouldn't expire for 67 years. So who set up the trust? If Castellano died in 1958, a crash from the basement cut her off. They froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Someone was in their house. Frank grabbed his old baseball bat from the hall closet, kept there for 20 years and never once used. Dorothy called 911, her fingers shaking on the phone. The operator's voice was calm, asking questions, saying police were on their way. But police were 5 minutes away, and whoever was in the basement was there now. Footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy, deliberate. Frank positioned himself in front of Dorothy, bat raised, looking utterly out of his depth and terrified but determined. The basement door opened. David Chen stepped through, looking disheveled and frightened. His expensive suit was torn, his face scratched, and he was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. "Please," he gasped, "you have to help me. They're coming." Behind him, the basement window shattered. 2 men in dark clothes and ski masks rappelled through, moving with military precision. They had Chen on the ground in seconds, zip-tying his hands, efficient and silent. Then they turned to Dorothy and Frank. "The cylinder," one of them said. His accent was hard to place, Eastern European, maybe Russian. "Give it to us, and no one gets hurt." Frank raised the bat. "Get out of our house." The man laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. Old man with a bat, very American, very stupid. His partner was already moving, scanning the kitchen with what looked like a handheld device. It beeped as it passed near the toolbox. "Here," he said. Frank swung the bat. He was 79 and out of practice, but 40 years of factory work had left him with surprising strength. The bat connected with the second man's shoulder, sending the device clattering across the floor. The first man pulled a gun. Dorothy screamed. And then the front door burst open. Patricia Vance came through first, followed by 4 agents in FBI vests, weapons drawn. The 2 intruders didn't even try to fight. They dropped to the ground, hands behind their heads, professional enough to know when they were beaten. Within minutes, Dorothy and Frank's quiet house was a crime scene. Agents everywhere, photographing, documenting, securing. Chen was hauled out on a stretcher, still zip-tied, protesting his innocence. The 2 intruders were led away in actual handcuffs. Vance approached Dorothy and Frank, who were sitting on their couch, shell-shocked. "Are you injured?" "No," Dorothy managed, "just terrified." Understandable. Those were Russian intelligence officers. They've been tracking Castellano's device for years. Chen was working for a Chinese tech consortium. There's also a team from a private military contractor somewhere in the area, and we've had reports of interest from at least 3 other nations. "All for a cylinder from 1957, Frank said numbly. "All for what's inside it. Mr. Keating, Mrs. Keating, I wasn't exaggerating this morning. You're in possession of something extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily dangerous. Now, will you please let us secure it?" Dorothy looked at the toolbox, at the tiny photograph of a father and son, at the device that had turned their lives upside down in less than 48 hours. "No," she said. Vance blinked. "I'm sorry? It's not ours to give. It belongs to Bobby Costello, Roberto's son. It was left for him. We need to return it to him. Mrs. Keating, we don't even know if Robert Costello Jr. is still alive." "He is." Chen's voice came from near the door. He'd somehow gotten free of his stretcher and was standing there, disheveled but determined. "He's alive. I wasn't lying about that. Everything I told you yesterday was true. My client wants to return this to the Costello family, to let Bobby finally understand what his father created." "And who exactly is your client?" Vance demanded. Chen smiled weakly. "Someone who's been protecting that storage unit for 67 years. Someone who set up the trust. Someone who knew that eventually the right people would find it." "Who?" Dorothy asked. "Me," came a voice from the doorway. They all turned. An elderly man stood there, leaning on a cane, his breathing labored from the walk from the street. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and familiar. Dorothy recognized him from Chen's photograph, Bobby Castellano. He nodded slowly. "I prefer Robert these days, but yes, I'm Roberto Castellano's son." He looked at the toolbox on the kitchen counter. "And I'd very much like to see what my father left me." The room fell silent. Vance was calculating, her hand near her weapon but not on it. Chen looked relieved. The FBI agents were confused, waiting for orders. And Dorothy thought about the photograph, about a father leaving something for his son, about mysteries spanning decades and love transcending death. "It's yours," she said, standing. "It was always yours." She lifted the toolbox and carried it to Robert Castellano. He took it with trembling hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I was 6, he said softly, "when my father died. I barely remember him, just fragments, his laugh, the smell of his pipe tobacco, the way he'd let me help in his workshop. After the fire, my mother moved us to California, changed our names. She was terrified they'd come for us, too. Who? Frank asked. Whoever killed my father. We never knew for sure. The police said it was an accident, faulty wiring. But my mother knew better. She knew he'd been working on something important, something dangerous. She spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. He opened the toolbox, lifting the cylinder with reverent care. I didn't learn the truth until I was 40. Found some old letters my mother had hidden. My father had written to her the day he died, told her where he'd hidden his most important work. But the letter was damaged. I only got fragments. It took me another 20 years to track down the storage facility, and by then the trust my father had set up was impenetrable. All I could do was watch and wait. "You hired Chen," Dorothy said. "I hired Chen to make sure that when the trust finally expired, whoever found the device understood its value. I'm 83 years old, dying of emphysema. I needed to make sure this didn't fall into the wrong hands before I could claim it." He looked at Vance. "Which is why I'm donating it to the Smithsonian to be opened in a controlled environment with the findings made public. My father believed in the free exchange of knowledge. He wouldn't want his invention hoarded by governments or corporations." Vance's expression was unreadable. "Mr. Castellano, I have orders to secure that device. And I have lawyers who've been preparing for this moment for 20 years. You can try to take it, but I promise you, the legal battle will be very public and very embarrassing for your department." They stared at each other, will versus authority, old man versus government agent. Finally, Vance nodded curtly. "I'll need to make some calls." She walked away, phone already at her ear. Chen limped over, his cut eye now bandaged by one of the EMTs. "Thank you," he said to Dorothy and Frank, "for trusting us, for doing the right thing." "We almost didn't," Frank admitted, "if those Russians hadn't broken in. They would have found another way. This device, it's been pulling people toward it for decades, like gravity, like destiny." Chen looked at Robert Castellano, who was staring at the cylinder with an expression of profound longing. Some things are meant to be found when the time is right. Over the next few hours, Dorothy and Frank's house gradually emptied. The FBI agents left first, then the crime scene techs. Chen departed in an ambulance. His injuries were minor, but he wanted them documented for the lawsuit he planned to file. Eventually, only Robert Castellano remained, sitting in their living room with the cylinder on his lap. "Can I ask you something?" Dorothy said, bringing him tea he probably wouldn't drink. "Why wait so long? If you knew about the storage unit, why not just break in or hire someone to steal it? Because that's not what my father would have wanted. He set up that trust for a reason, to make sure enough time passed that his invention couldn't be weaponized, couldn't be used to give one nation an advantage over others. By 2025, quantum computing is a known field. Multiple nations have the technology. What's in this cylinder might accelerate development, but it won't give anyone an insurmountable edge." "You don't know what's in there," Frank pointed out. "No, but I know my father. He was a cautious man, despite his brilliance. He would have thought through every possibility." Robert set down his teacup and began examining the cylinder more carefully. "There's a mechanism here," he murmured, his fingers finding the seam Dorothy had noticed. "Some kind of lock. Morrison, the physicist we consulted, said it might require specific conditions to open," Dorothy said. "Or a key." Robert pulled out the tiny photograph Dorothy had found. "My father loved puzzles. When I was little, he'd hide things for me to find, always with clues." He held the photograph up to the light, squinting at it. "Look at the background, the laboratory window. Do you see it?" Dorothy leaned in. Behind the figures of father and son, visible through the window, was a clock on the wall. The hands showed 3:17. "A time," she breathed. "Or a combination." Robert's fingers flew over the cylinder's surface, finding tiny indentations Dorothy had mistaken for age and wear. They were numbers, barely visible, arranged in a circle around the cylinder's base. He aligned them. 3, 1, 7. There was a soft click. The cylinder's top separated from its body with a whisper of released air that had been sealed for 67 years. Robert lifted it off, revealing a cavity lined with what looked like copper or gold, some kind of metallic shielding. Inside was a smaller cylinder, this one made of glass or crystal, filled with a silvery liquid that seemed to move on its own, swirling in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Suspended in the liquid were 7 small spheres, each one glowing faintly with different colors. "My God," Robert whispered. "He actually did it." "Did what?" Frank asked. "Quantum storage. Real, stable quantum storage." Robert's hands shook as he held the glass cylinder up to the light. These spheres, they're quantum wells. Isolated systems where information can be encoded in quantum states and preserved indefinitely. In 1957, we barely understood quantum mechanics. We didn't have the technology to manipulate individual atoms, but my father found a way. "What information is stored in them?" Dorothy asked. "I don't know. It would take specialized equipment to read them without collapsing the quantum states. But if each sphere can store even a fraction of what quantum theory suggests," he did some mental calculation, "we could be looking at terabytes of data, maybe petabytes, in 7 spheres the size of marbles, created in 1957. He carefully replaced the glass cylinder in its protective housing and resealed the outer cylinder. "This needs to go to Princeton immediately, or MIT, somewhere with the capability to read it properly."
But what if it's dangerous?
Dorothy asked. "What if your father stored something that was better left forgotten?" Robert met her eyes. "My father died for this. He hid it, protected it, made sure it would survive until the right time. I have to believe he did that because what's inside is important. Maybe it's scientific data, maybe it's a message, maybe it's just his research notes. But whatever it is, it's his legacy, and I owe it to him to share it with the world." Their son Michael arrived just after midnight, exhausted from a rushed flight and frantic with worry. He burst through the door with a colleague in tow, both of them loaded down with briefcases and looking ready for a legal war. "Mom! Dad! I got here as fast as—" He stopped, seeing the scene in the living room. "What happened? Are you okay?" "We're fine," Dorothy assured him. "It's been an eventful day, but we're fine." She introduced Robert Castellano and explained the situation. As Michael listened, his expression shifted from alarm to fascination to professional interest. "So you're donating it to the Smithsonian?" he asked Robert. "That's the plan. Make the contents public domain. Let scientists around the world study it." Michael exchanged a look with his colleague. "With all due respect, Mr. Castellano, that might not be the best approach. If the contents are as valuable as you think, making them immediately public could create chaos. Multiple parties trying to claim rights, governments attempting to classify the information, corporations filing patents on anything they can extract from the data. So what do you suggest? A controlled release. Donate the physical device to a museum, yes, but the contents, establish a foundation, oversee the research, make sure the information is disseminated responsibly. That way, you maintain some control, ensure your father's legacy is protected, and prevent any single entity from monopolizing the discovery." Robert considered this. "I'm 83 and dying. I don't have time to run a foundation." "You don't have to," Michael said. "That's what lawyers are for. We can set it up, build in controls and safeguards, make sure everything proceeds according to your wishes, even after—" He trailed off tactfully. "Even after I'm dead," Robert finished. He smiled. "You're very good at this. Your parents must be proud." "They are," Dorothy said, squeezing Michael's hand. "Very proud." The rest of the night was spent in planning. Michael and his colleague drafted documents on their laptops while Robert told stories about his father, fragments of memory preserved more reliably than any quantum device. By dawn, they had a framework, the Castellano Foundation for Advanced Research, dedicated to the responsible study and dissemination of Roberto Castellano's work. As the sun rose, painting their living room in shades of gold and pink, Dorothy looked around at the unlikely group assembled in her home. An elderly son searching for his father, a lawyer who'd flown across the country to protect his parents, a mysterious invention that had survived decades hidden in darkness. All of it converging in their small house on Elm Street because she and Frank had spent $2 on a storage unit that no one else wanted. "You know what the strangest part is?" she said to Frank, who sat beside her on the couch, looking exhausted but content. "We almost didn't go to the auction. You wanted to stay home and work on your trains. And you wanted to go to the library," Frank remembered. "But then you got that feeling. My grandmother's intuition. Turns out it's worth more than $2. They laughed, and the sound was warm and real, cutting through the tension and fear that had dominated the past 2 days. Robert looked over at them, his expression soft with something like envy. "You're lucky," he said, "to have each other, to have built a life together. My father and mother had that, I think, before everything fell apart. I never did. Spent too much time chasing ghosts, trying to understand a man I barely remembered." "You'll understand him now," Dorothy said. "Whatever's in that device, it's a message from your father. He made sure of that. Maybe, or maybe the real message is simpler than that. Maybe he just wanted me to know that he loved me enough to protect his greatest achievement for me to find. Maybe that's enough." The Smithsonian sent a team 3 days later. They arrived with climate-controlled cases, security escorts, and enough paperwork to fill one of Frank's toolboxes. The cylinder was transported to Washington, D.C. with more care than Dorothy and Frank had shown anything in their lives. The foundation was officially established within a week. Robert Castellano named Michael and his colleague as primary trustees, with a team of scientists and ethicists to oversee the research. The unsealing of the device was scheduled for a month later, giving them time to prepare proper facilities and invite observers from multiple institutions. Dorothy and Frank were invited to attend, but they declined. They'd played their part, found the device, protected it long enough for the right person to claim it, made sure it would be used properly. The rest was for others to discover. Instead, they returned to their normal lives, or as normal as life could be after their quiet house had been invaded by Russian agents and their dining room had briefly held a quantum time capsule worth potentially billions. The storage facility sent them a check for $18, their portion of the auction proceeds after fees. Frank framed it and hung it on his workshop wall. "Most expensive $2 we ever spent," he joked. But Dorothy knew better. The real cost hadn't been monetary. It had been the fear, the sleepless nights, the moment when men with guns had stood in their kitchen. It had been worth it, helping Robert find his father, making sure Castellano's legacy survived. But she was glad it was over. Or so she thought. The unsealing happened on a Tuesday in November. Michael called them from the Smithsonian, describing the scene. Dozens of scientists, representatives from universities around the world, even some government officials who'd tried and failed to claim jurisdiction. The quantum wells were carefully extracted from their protective housing. Specialized equipment was used to read the information encoded in their quantum states without collapsing them. The process took hours, with scientists murmuring in excitement as data began to appear on their screens. "Mom," Michael said, his voice hushed with awe, "you need to see this. I'm sending you a video link." Dorothy and Frank huddled around her laptop, watching the grainy feed from the Smithsonian's research lab. On screen, the data from the first quantum well was being reconstructed. Text appeared, dense and technical, equations and diagrams that meant nothing to Dorothy but seemed to electrify the scientists watching. But then images began to appear, photographs, and Dorothy recognized them. One showed a young woman at a piano, fingers frozen mid-chord, captured in a moment of pure concentration. Another showed a boy, Bobby, laughing as he chased a dog through a yard. A third showed Roberto Castellano himself, older than in any photograph Dorothy had seen, standing in his workshop with his arm around his wife. "He didn't store research," she whispered. "He stored memories." On screen, more images appeared. Roberto teaching his son to tie his shoes, the family at dinner, a birthday party with a homemade cake. Ordinary moments, captured and preserved in quantum amber, protected for 67 years so his son could see them. The scientists were confused, disappointed maybe. They'd expected revolutionary technology, not family photographs. But Robert Castellano was weeping. Dorothy could see him on the video feed, his face and his hands, shoulders shaking. Because he'd been 6 when his father died. He barely remembered him. And now, encoded in quantum states that wouldn't degrade for millennia, his father had left him a lifetime of memories he thought were lost forever. The 7th and final quantum well contained only text. A letter, written in 1958, the day before Roberto Castellano died.
My dear Bobby, if you're reading this, I am gone, and you have grown into a man without me. I'm sorry for that. I would have given anything to watch you grow, to teach you, to know you as an adult. I don't know how I will die, but I know it's coming. There are people who want what I've created, and I've learned that some knowledge is dangerous to possess. I've stored my research in the first 5 wells: quantum computing principles, information storage techniques, discoveries that may help future generations. Take them, use them, give them to the world. But the 6th well is for you, memories of our time together, the childhood you'll barely remember. I've encoded every photograph we ever took, every home movie, every recording of your voice I could find. Not to make you sad, but to show you that you were loved, that our time together, however brief, was real and precious. And this 7th well is my final message. Live, Bobby. Don't spend your life chasing my ghost. Don't let my death define you. Build something of your own. Love someone. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you. I love you, son. I love you across time, across death, across every quantum possibility. In any universe, in any timeline, you are my greatest achievement. Your father, Roberto. The video feed showed Robert Castellano standing, walking to the quantum wells, touching the glass housing that held his father's love, preserved in states of quantum superposition. Scientists backed away, giving him space, understanding that this moment was bigger than research, bigger than discovery. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes. Frank's hand found hers, squeezing tight. "We did good," he said softly. "We did right." "Yes," Dorothy agreed. "We did." The fallout from the discovery dominated news cycles for weeks.
Castellano's research was published in multiple scientific journals, each paper dense with implications for the future of quantum computing and information storage. His work would accelerate development by years, maybe decades. Patents were filed, companies formed, grant money allocated. But for Dorothy and Frank, the real story was simpler. A father's love, preserved against impossible odds, finally reaching his son. Robert Castellano lived through another 7 months. He spent them reviewing his father's research, reading the letter over and over, watching the preserved memories. He gave interviews about the discovery, always making sure to credit the elderly couple who'd bought a $2 storage unit and had the courage to see it through. He died peacefully in March, and at his funeral, they played a recording from one of the quantum wells. Roberto Castellano reading his son a bedtime story in 1956, his voice warm and alive after 69 years of silence. Dorothy and Frank attended, sitting in the back, anonymous among the scientists and officials and curious onlookers. They didn't need recognition. They'd received something more valuable, the knowledge that they'd helped complete a story that had been waiting nearly 7 decades for its ending. Driving home from the funeral, Frank asked, "Do you ever wonder what else might be in storage units out there? What other secrets people have hidden?" Dorothy smiled. "Sometimes, but I think we've had enough adventure for one lifetime." "Agreed." "Though," he glanced at her with a familiar mischievous look, "there is an auction next Tuesday. Ed mentioned it. They've got a unit that's been abandoned for 40 years. "Frank, I'm just saying, $2. What's the worst that could happen?" Dorothy laughed despite herself. "The worst? Armed Russians, federal agents, and a quantum physicist telling us we're sitting on billions of dollars? That's the worst." "Okay, but what are the odds of that happening twice?" They pulled into their driveway, their quiet house on Elm Street waiting for them. Inside, life would return to normal. Jigsaw puzzles, library books, Frank's model trains. The excitement was over. The mystery solved. The adventure concluded. But Dorothy thought about that storage unit auction next Tuesday. Thought about what might be hidden in the dark, waiting to be found. Thought about $2 and the chain of events it could set in motion. "Okay," she said finally, "but this time we bring bigger bolt cutters." Frank grinned. "That's my girl." And as they walked into their house, hand in hand, 49 years of marriage and one impossible adventure behind them, Dorothy thought about Roberto Castellano's final message to his son. Live. Don't spend your life chasing ghosts. Build something of your own. Love someone. Be happy. They'd built something. They'd loved each other. And yes, despite the fear and danger and chaos, they were happy. The quantum wells had proven that love could survive anything. Time, death, even the heat death of the universe. That was Roberto Castellano's real discovery, the one that mattered more than any scientific breakthrough. Love persists. Love endures. Love finds a way. Even in a $2 storage unit. Even after 67 years. Even when all logic says it should be impossible. Especially then.